All right.
Oh, good afternoon, Robert. Thanks very much for being with us from rainy Perth on Tuesday, the 30th of June, 2020. Robert, I think you're number 6 or 7 on our Tech for Good series here. So this is the second to last one, but not certainly least in respect to demonstrating some of the IT platforms that are supporting volunteer leaders with their COVID response, and then more generally, once we get out of the COVID funk and into business as usual, how we can kind of open people's ideas to open people's windows to new ideas on the technology that's available. So we have with us a couple of people today, so please feel free to make this as interactive as you feel encouraged to. Questions and answers during, at the end, and between, really happy to kind of take it as we go. So Robert, tell us a bit about yourself. You've been with Volunteer in Western Australia for some time now, haven't you?
Yeah, I've been working with Volunteering WA in one way or another since 1999, so I've been around quite a while. And yeah, we've been working on all kinds of IT platforms in one way or another since then.
Yeah. And that's coming up 21 years. That's incredible, given the most people's tenure in a job these days. What do you put that down to?
Well, Volunteering WA is a nice place to work. It's interesting, and it's always different and changing, so it's always a little bit fun.
Yeah.
I was also part-time for a large portion of that, so I've had other jobs as well, but I always kind of went back to VWA at some point or another.
Brilliant. Ah, terrific. Hey, so Victor, for anyone that doesn't know, actually is an acronym, isn't it? What does Victor stand for?
That's a really good question. I forgot, and I'm the only staff member that's been around long enough to remember, so that information has been lost to the sands of time. Sadly, no one knows what Victor stands for. It's really rather embarrassing. The V is probably volunteers or volunteering or something.
That's it. Yeah, totally. But we're here actually to talk about Vira. And Vira, any more success explaining what Vira stands for?
Oh yes, that one we had written down, so we know what that one is. Volunteer Information Records Administrator. It's
very good.
Yeah,
and it's got pretty considerable market capture, doesn't it, across Australia? I mean,
yep.
Can you tell us some of the stats about the involvement of Vira in VIOs across the country?
Well, it's used in all states in some form or another, and we've got a variety of volunteer involving organisations using it, from standard VIOs to local governments, and even some hospitals and so forth use Vira. And many of those also use the volunteer profile, which I will be mentioning briefly during the presentation as well.
Terrific, terrific. Well, without further ado, I understand you're going to walk us through the system, and Emma, Mel, and anybody else that is watching wider web or at a later stage, feel free to get in touch with Robert, get your contact details through the session, and by all means ask any questions. So over to you, Robert.
No worries, I'll just get started. Now, as was mentioned, if you do have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll be going through this fairly quickly so we don't take up too much time. So if I'm rushing through something a bit fast, do let me know. And I'll just switch over so you can see the screen now. All right, hopefully everyone can now see the login screen.
Sure can, that's great.
All righty. So Vira and Victor are actually integrated together. If you have one, then you will have access, or if you have access to Victor, then you will be able to transfer data from there into Vira. So that can actually be a fairly good time saver. So I've just gotten us into the Vira system, and we can see that we've got a dashboard, which gives us a little bit of information, how many active volunteers we've got, how many applications we've got pending still to process, how many events we've got scheduled, just a little bit of stats about our volunteers, and some buttons down the bottom for shortcuts. This section is the volunteers area. It's where we can view our volunteers. Now we do have filters if you need to find a volunteer. and we can just click on any volunteer to view their details. So this is a volunteer record in Vira. We've got the general areas down the side here, and any sub-tabs will be along the top here. So we've got their contact information here. If we have a picture for them, it'll be showing there. We store addresses and phone numbers. We have integrated contact management, so you can add contact groups, you can add volunteers to contact groups, etc. And we store an emergency contact. We also have details. Yep.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, can you functionally communicate through the platform through email and SMS and things like that, or how does that work? Yeah.
Yes, you can. We do have a contact management function built in, as I mentioned. You will actually pop open a new tab to do your contact management. It's separated like that for convenience because the system also allows you to keep details of non-volunteer contacts. You might, for example, want to keep details of, say, media contacts or similar that you'll want to receive your mail outs. You'll probably want to put them into the system, but you don't want them to be volunteers. You just want them to be contacts. So we do actually allow for that as well.
Great.
Okay, so we've got a volunteer details section here. So we have skills, previous work experience, t-shirt size, what transport they have, driver's license details, vehicle type, medical history, dietary requirements. These are all optional. You don't need to fill them out, but for certain volunteers, you will need them. We have the status here. So we can assign volunteers to a program. We can create our own programs and use them to group volunteers. We can say whether a volunteer is currently volunteering or not currently volunteering, and we have a record of when they've been unavailable in the past. So if they need to be suspended for 6 months or something, we can note that in the system. We have an availability, so we can check when the volunteer is available. We can store any languages that they speak. This is any skills that they would like to use. It's a broad skills category, similar to the ones used in Victor and on Seek Volunteer and so forth. So you just have a bit of a record of the things that they would like to do. And you can also record any professional skills they have. For example, if they have experience in accounting, you can say they may have 1 to 3 years. So that lets you keep a more accurate record of exact professional skills that they have if you're using skilled volunteers. We also store up to 2 references you can check. We have a statistics page. This entire page is optional, but if you need to gather statistics for any of your reporting, you can put the information in there. And lastly, we have a tagging system. You can create your own tags and then apply them to volunteers as you choose.
Great.
So that, in a nutshell, is your base volunteer information. And now we're moving on to the individual records that you're saving about the volunteers. So here we have hours. This is a record of all the volunteering that the volunteer has done for you. It keeps a record of what they did, when they did it, how long it took, etc. It's one of the main things you use for reporting because this allows you to calculate out the contribution that volunteers are making to your organization, and that's obviously a handy thing to have in your reporting. We also have a schedule. So, for example, with this guy, you can see that he is attending Mondays every week and Fridays fortnightly. So this is a schedule that's been set for this volunteer, and unless you tell the system otherwise, it will automatically add these at the appropriate time. So in this case, because he's on a regular schedule, you don't need to enter the hours, they will just be entered for you.
Yep. Robert, can the volunteers update their hours themselves, or is there,
yes.
How, I mean, maybe you'll get to this, so maybe I'm just jumping in, so by all means.
We actually have a huge number of ways of entering hours to reflect the different ways that volunteer involving organizations like to do it. Yes, volunteers can enter their own hours through their volunteer profile. You just need to set what they have active. They can then go into the profile, log the hours, and then the hours will appear here in Vira for you to confirm. We also have a sign-in sheet on Vira, so you can actually pop open a screen on Vira that will let you sign in, sign out volunteers. I'll actually show you that now because it's kind of interesting. So we go down here, we say view sign-in sheet. All right. So for the sign-in sheet, all you need to do is leave it running on a shared computer or an iPad or something at reception, and you can select the volunteer you're interested in. say this guy, signs in. This guy will remain signed in, doing the last role he was assigned to do until he is signed out. So again, you can just leave this running at a machine in reception. We also have the option to leave this logged in for 12 hours, in which case it will shut off all of the other tabs, and the only thing volunteers will be able to do is log in and log out. So
great.
Sign-in sheet, as I said, we can do it through the profile. I'll demonstrate that later on when we go through the volunteer profile. We also have methods that you can use to bulk enter information on hours a little bit more quickly. I'll show you that in administration, but yeah, we have a lot of options for this. Anyway, I'll just hop back to the volunteer we were looking at. So yes, we were just looking at the schedule. We also have an option to view the entire schedule. So you can view all of the volunteers that you've got scheduled to come in a calendar format. I'll show you that later as well. But for next, we've got reimbursements. Now, reimbursements obviously is whenever you reimburse the volunteer for something that they had to spend out of pocket, say parking or whatever. This lets you record whenever a volunteer has been reimbursed for something. Put in how much it was, and it just records it. This is kind of handy because it lets you know when volunteers are claiming reimbursement and what you're spending your reimbursement on. If you've had to manage volunteers extensively, you'll be aware that you can get some really weird situations occurring where volunteers get really awkward about asking for reimbursement, and then because they're not receiving reimbursement, they wind up feeling a little bit disgruntled, and it can be a whole issue for you. So if you just keep track of when volunteers are being reimbursed, if someone's not claiming reimbursement, you can just quietly remind them that they're eligible for it, and then if they do need the money, they will ask. So that's kind of handy. Similarly, recognition does very much the same sort of thing, in that it keeps a record of any recognition events that the volunteers attended, ranging from personal thank yous to events they've attended. This means that you can then again keep track of if a volunteer has attended functions or any other kind of thank you events. That's not to say that all volunteers are the same and all volunteers want a massive party thrown in their honor. A lot of volunteers would find that very awkward. But if a volunteer is not receiving some kind of recognition, you can at least have a word with them and discuss what they might like.
And I'm guessing you've got the reports tab up the top. Does that mean that these these data sets can be then pushed into a report so you can get a measure of all the recognition events in the last month or what have you? Or
Yep, that's correct. You can look at all of the events that have happened and so forth. And of course, you can dump all of that into Excel if you'd like to make graphs or if you need to do any sort of data mining. We've got the option for that as well. The next tab along we've got is capabilities. Now, the capabilities tab is one of the most important because it keeps track of things that the volunteer is capable of doing. The first one we've got here is certificates. So this is things like first aid certificates, national police checks, working with children checks, etc. You select the certificate type you want, you put in a reference number if applicable, and you put in the expiry date. This will then record that the volunteer has the appropriate certificate. When this certificate is getting close to expiry, the system will actually remind you that the volunteer needs to have that certificate renewed. It'll send you an email. So that's a very handy way of making sure that your volunteers are always up to date with all of the certificates that they have. And you can, of course, create your own certificate types if you need to add any specific ones that are relevant for your organization.
Right.
We've got a whole bunch by default, but you can add more. Training works in a similar way. You've got your standard training types, but you can add additional training, and then you can record what training the volunteer has done, how long they spent doing it, and did they complete it. So you then have a record of all of the training the volunteers completed. And later on, I'll show you that we can search for volunteers by any of these criteria. So we can find volunteers that have completed training or have certain certificates or whatever if we need volunteers like that. Lastly, we've got the permissions. The permissions are things that the volunteer grants you as the organization. For example, are you allowed to publish their name in your promotional materials? Can you take their photo? That kind of thing. So we've just got a record of all of the things that the volunteer has allowed. The last one we have down here is the history section. So the history section covers all of the things that the volunteer has done in the past. First up, we've got file notes. File notes are records that your staff makes about the volunteer. These are not viewable to the volunteer, they're just viewable to VIO staff. And it's essentially a way you can keep a record of conversations you've had with the volunteer that might be relevant. for example, you can see here that we've discussed parking arrangements with this guy once before. So if, for example, you were finding that they were parking in the wrong area, and then you looked in the record and you find that this has been mentioned to the volunteer, 7 or 8 times previously, then maybe you might want to escalate it and have a bit of a sort of more serious chat with the volunteer.
Great. Mel, sorry, Robert, just interjecting there. Mel has asked if selected volunteer records entered into Victor be transferred into Vira?
Yes. If a volunteer has come through Victor, Seek Volunteer, Go Volunteer, any of those recruitment options, the volunteer's details will actually be held in the pending tab. And then if you accept that volunteer, the volunteer and all of their details will move straight into Vira. Also, if they happen to have a volunteer profile, that information will come across as well. So in theory, you might have an almost complete volunteer record just from one application. I'll show you how to do that a little bit later.
Great.
Anyway, just to finish off the volunteer record, we've got the volunteer's CV. If they have a CV uploaded, it's here. They can upload their own CV on their volunteer profile. You can add one for them as well. You can also view it, etc. If you need to store any files related to the volunteer, you can do so here. So if it's a requirement that you keep a scanned copy of them agreeing to your terms and services or terms and conditions, you can upload that here. If you need a actual scanned copy of any of the certificates, again, you can upload it here. And this will just keep all of the files related to this particular volunteer. Lastly, we've got positions. This is a record of any positions that this volunteer has previously applied for through any of the systems that Vira is connected to. So again, Go Volunteer, Seek Volunteer, Victor, etc. If they've applied for roles and been accepted for them with your organization, you'll see that here. So you'll actually have sort of like a bit of a history about what they've done for you in the past. This is particularly useful if you've got event volunteers, because then you'll see all of the events that they've done for you. And it's a really handy way of just quickly looking to see if this person has the experience you need. So that is volunteers and volunteer records in general. I'm just going to step across to the volunteer profile briefly because it's very similar. Now I'm actually going to log into my own volunteer profile. So I do apologize for it being a little bit messy. All right, so this is my volunteer profile. As you can see, I haven't got a photo uploaded, but got a little bit about me. Contact details, urgency contact, again, this information. These are things that I like, what times I'm available, etc. So as you can see, this matches up very closely with the information that's available in Vira, and anything that I change here will be changed in Vira immediately. Yep. Skills and experience, etc. I can also log hours by clicking here. Sorry, running a bit slow today. There we go. So I can select the task I was doing, put in the date, put in the hours and click log, and that will then just add my hours into Vira as well. Now, we also have the option to customize volunteer profiles. If your organization would like your own sort of volunteer profile, so to speak, we can actually have an organization's icon up there, and we can change these colors to match your organizational colors and give you a custom URL for volunteers to access. This means that if you want your volunteers to use the profile extensively, you do have the option to do this. There's a slight additional cost at that, but it's not very expensive. Anyway, I'll go back to Vira now.
So that volunteer profile, that accumulates their total hours?
Yep.
Per role, does it? Yep. So it
Yep.
can be, yeah, great.
Yeah, basically what they get is a sort of little history of their volunteering so they can see everything they've done. We are potentially looking at upgrades in the next year or so where the volunteer profile will actually create a CV for them with all of their volunteering experience and so forth.
Great.
That's really going to be aimed at in particular, younger volunteers or volunteers seeking employment, because well, I can actually speak from personal experience and say that if you've done volunteering in a field, it's a lot easier to get a job in that field. It's not just the experience, but the commitment that you show by doing it. So we're hoping that that will be useful for volunteers, yes.
Great.
Anyway, I will now move on to the scheduling. As I mentioned, Vira does have an inbuilt scheduler which allows you to view all of the volunteers that you've got scheduled to attend. Now you can see the ones in green are in the past, the ones in blue are in the future. So I can see I've got 2 volunteers scheduled to come in on Friday. I can click and I can see who they are and what they'll be doing and their hours. Likewise, I can also view back in the past, and that'll tell me what happened previously. So it's very straightforward. It lets you see exactly who's scheduled to come in when. As a sort of enhancement of that, we also have an events calendar. Now, the way the events calendar works is it allows you to set up events that will be occurring at some point in the future. So let's say I want an event happening, we'll say then. So I'm creating a new event, give it a name. I can set up the default times. I can link this event to a position that's happening, and then this will pull the information from your recruitment platform, whether that be Victor or GoVolunteer or whatever else you're using.
Great.
Yep, we say we want more volunteers for this, and we say save. So now we have an event created. We can make this a recurring event, so we can say that this event occurs weekly, monthly, fortnightly, daily, whatever. And we can also add volunteers. We can either do a quick add, where we just select a volunteer. Say he'll be okay, and we can see that that person is now set as attending. Add a couple more volunteers. So we can create, a sort of roster of volunteers that will be attending the event, what they'll be doing, and so forth. We also have a volunteer search. So if we have a volunteer or a task that needs to be done and we don't know for the volunteer, we can actually search for volunteers. Now I'll pop open our advanced filters, and we can either search for volunteers that have an advanced skill. We can do a text search. So if anybody has, for example, let's say MyOB, that'll do a text search and find everybody that has MyOB in their profile anywhere.
Terrific.
We can search current volunteers or former volunteers. We can search for volunteers that have a certain interest, have flagged themselves as available for certain things, speak a certain language, interested in a certain service focus. We can select volunteers in an area. We can have them meeting certain requirements, volunteers that are available at certain times. We can select volunteers that registered between certain dates if we only want volunteers that have been with us for a while, or if we only want recent volunteers. Volunteers that have a certain certificate, have done certain training, or have granted a certain permission to us. Volunteers that manage their own profile or do not, and we can also select specifically tagged volunteers. So you can search for any and all of these criteria, and you just hit filter, and it will show you all of the volunteers that match. So in this case, we've got 4 guys that have something to do with MyOB. Pop open a quick window to look at his details. Yep, he has MyOB experience. Might give him a quick call or something, and if we decide he's appropriate, we can then just say add to event. Done. So we now have 3 volunteers set as attending this particular event.
Yeah. Excellent.
Now we've got a couple of options we can do. I'll just pop us back to the calendar, and so yep, we can see new event. There it is on the calendar. Now the calendar does support having multiple events on the same day and so forth. So if you have more than one event on a day, it'll just ask you to pick which one you mean. So we'll go in and have another look at it. We'll say, okay, we don't need any more volunteers. We now have enough volunteers. So it's good. We can generate an event mailing list. This will create a contact group with all of these volunteers in it. So you can then send these volunteers SMSs or emails. We can create an Excel spreadsheet for all of these volunteers. That will let you create a Excel file that has their name, contact details, the role they're assigned, start and end times, dietary requirements, t-shirt size, and any other information you might need. So that's basically a quick run sheet for the day, just in case you're in a situation where maybe at the event you won't have access conveniently to computers, or you probably don't want to pull out a tablet or something. You can just have this information on a clipboard if you need quick access to it. The other option we have is send hours. So once the event is complete and done, you come back in here and you might say, well, okay, I'll just check this guy because he actually had to stay an extra 15 minutes, so I'll adjust his time, no problem. And then I will click send hours. What that will do is it will confirm that all of these hours that you've got listed here are correct and enter them into the volunteers record for you, so you don't have to do that. So again, it's another way of getting hours into the system, and it's a little bit more convenient for you. So that's the event system in a nutshell.
Right.
We also have the search the volunteer search. I showed you this while we were using the events system, but you can just go in there and just find volunteers and use it to create spreadsheets of volunteers if you like, or find volunteers because you're looking for someone. Again, all of those options. Next section we've got along here is the pending section. Now the pending section is where applications come through to. So in this case, we've got pending volunteers. We can search our pending section for a specific person or an email address, just in case we have a lot of applications, we're looking for someone. Otherwise, they'll all be listed down here. Again, we can create spreadsheets of these people if we like. And what we can do is we can update their status. So we might say that this person has been interviewed. And this will then move them into the list of interviewed volunteers. We can set that up here so we can view volunteers that are pending, that is to say we haven't done anything with them. We can view volunteers that have been accepted, and we can view volunteers that have not yet been accepted. So this will be the volunteers that are still in progress. And there they are. So we might go back in here, yep, look at that person, say, yep, okay. Say accepted. And once we say accepted, then this volunteer will now appear on our Your Volunteers lists. And next section we're going to have a look at is reports. Now in reports, we have a whole bunch of different reports, and you can select a whole different variety of sort of ranges for them. So first we've got an active volunteer report. We can show all volunteers, or we can show only volunteers that are part of a certain program, or we can show only volunteers that have been tagged in a certain way. We can either display it on the screen or dump it to an Excel file, or output it to HTML if we need to. So that'll just be a list of all of our volunteers. We have a birthday report. The birthday report lets you select a month, and it will show you all of the volunteers that have a birthday in that month. If you're involved with volunteering, you'll know that volunteers tend to take their birthday cakes fairly seriously, so this will make sure that you purchase the correct amount of cakes. Very important. We have the volunteer contribution report. This is one of the standard reports. It lets you select a date range, and it will give you a summary of all of the volunteering that was done in that date range. So we can see this volunteer has done this volunteer has done those, and so forth. It gives us little totals. And at the bottom, we will get a complete total. Again, all of this can be dumped into Excel if you'd like to create graphs and so forth. The volunteer reimbursement report is again quite similar to that, except it shows us the reimbursements that have been granted. And the recognition report does the same thing for recognition. The volunteer statistics report produces aggregate statistics on volunteers. Now, this one is, as you can see, fairly useless unless you dump it into Excel, because obviously if you're doing this report, it's because somebody's asked you to pull out some kind of criteria. You'll need to do that by dumping into Excel, where all of these things will have been separated out into their own separate fields, so you can
Right.
create pie graphs, whatever you want, quite easily. The expiring certificates report allows you to check what volunteers have certificates that will expire by a certain date. The system does remind you of this automatically, but you might have a situation where you've got a major event coming up and you might want to start getting your volunteers organized sort of 6 months in advance. This report will let you do that. We can also view inactive volunteers. This will just let you check up on them and see maybe there's someone you want to reconnect with, etc. We have the hours summary. This shows you very similar information to the contribution report, but it's in this flat file format. This is really designed to be dumped into Excel for data mining purposes if you have a need to do that kind of thing. The last report we have is the board report. This is the program summary, which breaks down all of your volunteers by programs that you've assigned. So if you need to divide your volunteers up for reporting purposes, you just put that in as programs, print this report out, and then done. It'd be very handy if you need to create board reports and similar things. The last thing we've got is the administration section. So this is where you can create your own programs, you can create your own training types, your own certificates if needed, different permission types. You can create volunteer tags. You can set who receive notifications when volunteer certificates are expiring. And we also have a bulk entry for hours. So this is really designed around the common situation that a lot of VIOs have, which is you'll get an email saying that, oh yeah, all of these volunteers did this task. Well, what you can do is you can specify this was the task they were doing. They did it on, let's say, that date. And they did it for, let's say, 2 hours. And you just say continue. And then you can just select all of the volunteers that participated in that. Thusly. And you're done. That's it. The system has now entered all of the hours records for all of those volunteers that you've selected for you. Just because sometimes you do need to enter, a large number of volunteers doing a task. It's a lot faster to do it this way than searching the individual records and so forth.
Very good.
All right. So that's Vira in a nutshell. I've also shown you the volunteer profile. Did anybody have any questions that they wanted me to go through?
Please see out. Robert, we offline we're talking about APIs. What's some of the connections that Vira has into other platforms or other information management systems or anything like that? Is it a common part of the arrangement of Vira, or is it more of a standalone?
It really does depend on what the organization wants. By default, it will pull information from most of the common recruitment platforms, as I mentioned. A lot of websites and so forth that you apply for volunteer roles through will come straight through into Vira. In terms of integrations with on-site existing systems, such as if you want a single sign-on added to Vira, this is all doable. There does tend to be extra charges for us implementing this thing on a case-by-case basis, but we have had Vira integrated with single sign-on and similar things before. So it is possible to push information or pull information from those systems, or alternately push information to those systems depending on what you need.
Great. Robert, Emma asks, she is looking to set up a volunteer management program for her council. Can we set up multiple programs so each program manager can manage their own volunteers?
Yes, that can be done. Our recommended way of doing that is to set up, in that case, programs as their individual organizations. This is just based on my experience working with councils in the past, because that way it will also segregate their recruitment, which is actually kind of nice. There's no additional fee for setting it up in that manner. It's just a little bit more like an extra half hour or so on our end when we do the initial setup. And it does mean that you can grant logins to the different users in different areas. They won't be able to see each other's records. You can, of course, have a volunteer volunteering for both programs. That's fine. In that case, they will be able to view the core volunteer details, but not each other's calendars and so forth. So yeah.
Very good. Robert, the price of Vira is really competitively priced, isn't it? Like, it's not not an expensive platform if you are thinking about setting up your first VMS or volunteer management system or what have you. Top of your head, do you remember what the prices are? I just remember them being, very, very reasonable.
Yep. There's a setup fee which is around $250, and that covers just us creating the account, setting things up, creating the users, all that kind of stuff to start off with, and that's a once-off fee. After that, it depends on how many volunteers you've got in the system. If you've got less than 100 active volunteers, it's $100 a year plus GST. Please note that active volunteers does mean volunteers that are sort of current, active, and actively volunteering. If you've got like occasional volunteers that just pop in and do events and so forth, they don't count towards the total at all.
Great.
So yeah, it can be very cheap. There's also some limitations on the number of users you have depending on how much you pay, but yeah, it is fairly cheap. If you want to get a price list, you can just email vira@volunteeringwa.org.au. We'll send you through the current details.
Terrific. Any last questions? We're more than happy to take them. Otherwise, Robert, just while we're eliciting any last questions, what's your favourite part of Vira? What do you think is best part?
I'm very biased on this because I was actually involved in Homeless Connect, and we used Vira extensively for Homeless Connect, and we actually hooked up the Homeless Connect positions to the events in Homeless Connect in the calendar. So we could actually just recruit people online, and then when we accepted someone, their details would be added to the event automatically, and then we could just print off those things. So I actually found that very, very effective for what I was doing, although I understand not a lot of VIOs have need for that kind of thing.
Sure. Next question, Robert, is to me, which is, will we be able to access the recording after the event? Absolutely. It goes on the webinars page where all of our other webinars are retained. So you'll be able to get that tomorrow, probably at the earliest, Mel, but by all means it will be there. So you'll be able to go back over whatever Robert's shared, which has been a great presentation. Another question, Robert, for you. You mentioned linking up Seek and other platforms. Can you explain that a bit further?
Okay, it's Seek Volunteer, not the main Seek system, but the way that works is that any applications, like if you go into Seek Volunteer, you apply for a volunteer role. If you're advertising for a volunteer role and that advertisement is appearing on Seek, someone applies for it, you'll get the expression of interest normally, but the expression of interest will also appear right here, and that's it there. So it doesn't really matter what platform they applied from, whether it was Seek Volunteer, Go Volunteer, the Volunteering Victoria website, any of these platforms. The applications will actually come into here, and then you can actually just view the volunteer details directly rather than having to phone them up and find them or whatever. Now, obviously, it does depend on how much information the volunteer has got on the system about them as to how much you get. Worst case, you'll just get their name and contact details, but if this volunteer has done anything previously on the systems, you may well get full information through a volunteer profile on them.
Very good. Rightio. Look, thank you very much, Robert, for your time this afternoon. Or this, is it this morning for you, I imagine still, is it?
Just turning into afternoon right now. It's,
how about that?
Yeah.
Time to trot off and get some lunch after this then.
Yep.
Unless there's any more questions, please type them frantically. Otherwise, we'll sign off here and say that we've only got one more TECH4GOOD platform special next week, which is with a relatively new entrant to the market, Campfire, which was funded out of a Google grant. So we'll look forward to hearing what those folks are getting up to. So please think about registering for that one. But look, thank you, Robert, for your time. And as we said, Mel, this recording will be available after the fact. So all the very best to everybody listening, and thank you once again, and we'll see you all next week. Cheers, Robert.
See ya.